Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts about A Tomb for Boris Davidovich by Danilo Kiš. This is an extraordinary sequence of linked stories that examine the tragedies occurring during the great purges of the 1930s in the Soviet Union. And Kiš is really interested in the individual nature of these tragedies. Who were these people? What were their lives like? What were their voices, their ideas? Leading up to that fatal final moment, we know how each of these stories ends. Kiš often tells us how each of these stories is going to end. It's going to end with an execution that's really a murder. And he doesn't shy away from that tragedy. He doesn't shy away from that darkness. He wants to put a spotlight on it. He wants to, in a sense, redeem these voices, reclaim these lives, and share their stories with us. Where did they come from? Many of them don't come from the Soviet Union or from Russia. They come from all across Europe, but they're led inexorably towards this movement, towards this place, and ultimately towards the same end. And Kiš is very effective across this book. It really is quite extraordinary. It's probably one of the 3 best books I've read this year, and I would highly encourage folks to check it out. But he wants to examine not just that individual tragedy, but expand it out and explore how were the great purges and that threat of constant violence. How was that a cultural tragedy as well across other countries in Europe? And he's startlingly effective with that. Now, Kiš is writing this as a Serbian, then Yugoslavian, in the 1970s. A decade earlier, he saw what happened in Czechoslovakia. As a young adult, he saw what happened in Hungary. As a boy, he lived through World War II. So he has all these personal experiences, and he takes all of those ideas, everything he has witnessed, and he takes it all the way back to around the time he was born in the 1930s. And he uses an interesting technique to tell these stories. Many of them are from the perspective of someone who has, in a sense, compiled a case file. And that has a very interesting effect because it seems to distance us from each of these characters, from their voices. We are told little facts about their lives. We're told, in this sparse, spare diction, what's been going on. Witnesses are brought forward who tell stories about these people. Dialogue is shared. But gradually, across each story, we get closer and closer and closer to that individual, to the person whose story Kiš wants to share, that he almost feels like compelled to share, despite the threat of what could happen to him under the censorship in Yugoslavia. And as I said, it works. It's startling. So I want to share a couple of examples. In one, we have the knife with the rosewood handle. At the end of September, Mikuyu was returning on his bicycle from the estate of Herr Baltescu, the fur merchant of Antonovka. Over the forest rose a red cloud, anticipating the autumn winds. Along the way, Imik, in his own shiny bicycle, joined him, and for a while rode alongside without saying a word. Then he set up a meeting with Mikuyu for the following evening and abruptly turned into a side street. Mikuyu arrived at the appointed hour and gave the agreed-upon signal. Imik opened the door but did not turn on the light. "I'll be brief," he said. "I set up a meeting with each of the members at a different time and place. The police agents showed up at only one of these places." He paused. "At Bagarian's mill," he finally said. Mikuyu was silent. He waited to hear the trader's name. "You don't ask," said Imik, "who I was going to meet at Bagarian's mill." "Whoever it is," said Mikuyu laconically. "I wouldn't like to be in his skin." Imik didn't tell him the name of the traitor that night. He never told him, as if he didn't want that dishonored name to pass his lips. He told him only that he was relying on his loyalty and hatred. And he said, "You'll see the face of the traitor, but don't get taken in by appearances. A traitor's face can take on a look of great righteousness." Mikuyu spent a sleepless night. He tried to slip the deadly mask of the traitor onto the face of each of his comrades. But while it fitted the face of each, it suited none completely. Wearing a rubber apron, bloody to his elbows, he spent the entire next day slaughtering and skinning lambs on Herr Baltescu's estate. At dusk, he washed himself at the water trough, put on his dark suit, tucked a red carnation in the brim of his hat, and rode to the edge of the forest on his bicycle. He continued to the mill on foot, through the autumn forest, treading the thick leaves, which muffled the terrible resolution of his footsteps. And so there we're told about the perspective, the life of someone who is going to become complicit in one of these murders, who, as part of the movement, will be the agent of justice. And we see just how unjust it is, how unheroic this life is, that the clandestine nature of it does not seem romantic in any way. And Kiš is very clear about that there are people who led noble lives and had noble decisions, but the violence that was perpetrated against them was squalid. Another story opens the first act of the tragedy, or comedy in the scholastic sense of the word, whose main character is a certain Gold Verschoyle, begins as all earthly tragedies do, with birth. The rejected positivist formula of milieu and race can be applied to human beings to the same degree as to Flemish art. Thus the first act of the tragedy begins in Ireland, the Ultima Thule. He goes on, But let the dark clouds form, let a star fall, and suddenly the island again becomes as in a legend, that distant place, covered with fog and darkness, which for so long marked the boundary of the known world to navigators. And on the other side is a break, the dark sea in which the dead once found their land of eternity. Their black ships on shores with strange names testify to a time when travel had something metaphysical about it. They summon up dreams without shores, without return. And so he has these moments that seem very lyrical, that call out towards the deep sensibilities of European prose. But he's pushing at these ideas as a witness. In a sense, Kiš, as the narrator, is a shared witness to these events as he calls up so many other witnesses. Here, the reliability of the documents, resembling as they do palimpsests, is suspended for a moment. The life of Gold Verschoyle blends and merges with the life and death of the young Spanish Republic. We have only two snapshots, one with an unknown soldier next to the ruins of a shrine. On the back, in Verschoyle's handwriting, Alcázar, Viva la República. His high forehead is half covered by a Basque beret. A smile hovers around his lips on which one can read, from today's perspective, the triumph of the victor and the bitterness of the defeated, the paradoxical reflections that, like a line on the forehead, foreshadow inevitable death. Also a group snapshot with the date November 5th, 1936. The picture is blurred. Verschoyle is in the second row, still with the Basque beret pulled over his forehead. In front of the lined group, a landscape stretches out, and it would not be hard to believe that we are in a cemetery. Is this the honor guard that fired salvos into the sky or into living flesh? The face of Gold Verschoyle jealously guards this secret. Over the rows of soldiers' heads in the distant blue, an airplane hovers like a crucifix. And that's what many of these stories involve, are these documents that are described, moments that are described. Now, many of these are drawn directly from history. Kiš draws on history. The actual visit of a French official, Edouard Herriot, from the Popular Front in the 1930s to the Soviet Union, to Kiev, now in Ukraine, is described in here. And the way that the Communist Party had to go in and get some functionaries to dress it up like there was this church service that folks could go to. And then, of course, anyone who actually came to attend the church service would later be convicted of counter-revolutionary activities. And we get their sentences. And so that occurs. But the key to this book is A Tomb for Boris Davidovich. In many ways, if you've read Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler, you'll be able to spot what's going on here. There are ways in which BD, Boris Davidovich, is going to be a stalking horse for Nikolai Bukharin. And that longer story is really probably the heart and soul of this book. History recorded him as Novsky, which is only a pseudonym, or more precisely, one of his pseudonyms. But what immediately spawns out is the question, did history really record him? In the index of the Granat Encyclopedia, among the 246 authorized biographies and autobiographies of great men and participants in the revolution, his name is missing. In his commentary on this encyclopedia, Haupt notes that all the important figures of the revolution are represented, and laments only the surprising and inexplicable absence of Podvoisky. Even he fails to make any allusion to Novsky, whose role in the revolution was far more significant than that of Podvoisky. So in a surprising and inexplicable way, this man whose political principles gave validity to a rigorous ethic, this vehement internationalist, appears in the Revolutionary Chronicles as a character without a face or a voice. In this text, however fragmentary and incomplete, I shall try to bring to life the memory of the extraordinary and enigmatic person that was Novsky. Certain omissions, particularly those concerning the most important period of his life, the Revolution, and the years immediately following it, could be explained in much the same way. The above commentator explains other biographies. After 1917, his life merges with public life and becomes a part of history. And so we are told about the exploits of B.D. Novsky, and who goes by various names across the course of this long story. And we have his exploits, the ways in which he's involved in revolutionary activity before the 1917 revolution, the way in which he and his wife, at that time lover, lead a frigate on a chase across the Black Sea. And there's all these really fascinating moments. We get at one point a letter from those years written in Novsky's hand remains the only authentic document that combines deeply and mysteriously revolutionary passion with sensual love. As soon as I entered the university, I found myself in prison. I was arrested exactly 13 times. Of the 12 years that followed my first arrest, I spent more than half at hard labor. In addition, 3 times I walked the painful road of exile, a road that took 3 years of my life. During the brief periods of my freedom, I watched, as in a movie theater, the passing of sad Russian villages, towns, people, and events. But I was always in flight, on a horse, on a boat, in a cart. I never slept in the same bed for more than a month. I'd come to know the horror of Russian reality in the long, tedious winter evenings when the pale lights of Vasilevsky Island barely blink and a Russian village emerges in the moonlight in a false and deceptive beauty. My only passion was this arduous, rapturous, and mysterious profession of revolutionary. Forgive me, Zina, and carry me in your heart. It will be as painful as a kidney stone. And there we have the brilliant, droll irony, the humor that Kiš is striving to find in these voices as he tries to fan the flame and to give them, their identity back. One has this extended footnote. Ultimately, Bedinovsky, like the real Nikolai Bukharin, like the character in Darkness at Noon, Rubyshev, is brought to trial. He's arrested, brought to trial, and it's demanded that he confess. Nevertheless, it seems that in contact with the stone of his living tomb, Novsky drew some metaphysical conclusions, undoubtedly not much different from those suggesting the thought that man is only a speck of dust in the ocean of timelessness. But this also revealed to him another conclusion, which the architects of the doghouse could not have foreseen: nothing for nothing. The man who found in his heart this heretical and dangerous thought, which speaks of the futility of one's own being in time, finds himself, however, faced with another final dilemma: whether to accept the transitoriness of this being in time for the sake of that precious and expensively acquired knowledge, which excludes any morality and is therefore made in absolute freedom, or for the sake of that same knowledge, to yield oneself to the embrace of nothingness. We see Novsky's, sort of reflections. But we're at the same time given privy to the notes of the interrogators of how are they trying to extract this confession? What demands were they making? And he's at one point refers, he's now only the empty shell of a being, a heap of decayed and ever tortured flesh. In Novsky's dull gaze, one could read as the only sign of soul in life the decision to endure, to write the last page of his biography according to his own will. And fully conscious as one writes a last testament, he formulated his thought like this: I've reached my mature years. Why spoil my biography? Was he going to confess? And we know, and we're told what happened, how people are brought forward with their family members in the next cell, and they can hear the voices and how they're threatened. If you don't sign this confession for these folks, we're just going to murder your family member. And so all of this is made painfully clear. Executions occur right in front of this character's eyes. He therefore seemed to have realized that even this last trial was not only the final page of the autobiography which he'd been consciously writing with his blood and brain for some 40 years, but also that this was indeed the sum of his living, the conclusion on which everything hinged, and all the rest was, and had been, only a minor treatise, the arithmetical calculation whose value was insignificant in relation to the final formula that gave meaning to these subordinate operations. And Kiš conjures this feeling that ultimately everything he had led through, that this man who he thinks should have been in this set of biographies of the revolution, none of that matters depending on the final choices he makes in his final act. Will he confess? How will he confess? Will he find a way to sort of snatch his truth, his dignity, his autobiography in that confession? And towards the end of the story, this brave man died on November 21st, 1937 at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He left a few cigarettes and a toothbrush. And the subsequent story is then one that takes place during the Middle Ages and examines the forced conversions of Jewish people during a Catholic Inquisition. And he notes that he goes from Boris Davidovich to a Baruch who has the same BD initials. And Kiš draws on these stories, and he draws these parallels to examine how this is, as I said, a cultural tragedy. This is not just something that was occurring in the 1930s. Yes, in the 1930s, the Soviet Union, under the personal order of Stalin, murdered hundreds of thousands of people, mostly Ukrainians and Poles and Jewish individuals. But then we know that the Holocaust succeeds that in the 1940s, and we know the horrors there. We know that for thousands of years, or hundreds of years, there had been deep anti-Semitism across Europe. And so Kiš is drawing on all that. He's examining who were not just the lives that were destroyed, but the cultures that were destroyed as well. And as I said, he just has a real achievement here. Now, there are other works that he wrote. These were a little more autobiographical. Probably the best is Garden Ashes, which is set during the Holocaust. And Kiš himself had a Jewish family, and so this is sort of set during his parents' generation and what they saw. As I had mentioned, of course, Darkness at Noon with Rubyshev, gives us, by Arthur Koestler, gives us just one of the masterpieces of the 20th century. And I think a far more famous book than A Tomb for Boris Davidovich, but one that is much more focused on recreating life as fiction, reality as fiction, whereas Kiš has a different sensibility on display. But this is a great, great book if you have never read it. Thinking of other works that sort of have that emphasis on political oppression and the sort of the thirst for justice. I thought of the poems of Jack Mapanje, the Chattering Wagtails of Mikuyu prison, written while he was imprisoned in Malawi. Certainly within the stories of the Russian Revolution, the notebooks of Victor Serge, 1936 to 1947, these open during really the Great Purges, as Serge notes that he and his friends and family who are living in exile would talk about someone they hadn't heard from. Is that person still alive? And that is just there on each of these pages. Some of the characters one of the characters is indeed exiled to Kolyma on the far side of the Soviet Union. And Varlam Shalamov wrote a whole sequence of like hundreds and hundreds of pages of stories set there. Isaac Babel is explicitly called out. Isaac Babel was himself a victim of one of the Stalinist purges. And he is referenced on like the very first page of the very first story in A Tomb for Boris Davidovich. Obviously, I think many are probably thinking of Orwell, and so Animal Farm feels very close, but there are ways in which 1984 actually feels closer. Animal Farm is specifically dealing with the 1920s and 1930s Soviet Union, but 1984, the feeling, the dread that is in this book is probably closer to what Kiš was accomplishing. Certainly outside of Europe, there were totalitarian regimes, and outside of Africa, and so Ricardo Romero, The President's Room, this is probably one of the more insidious books I've read. Part of the Writers from the Other Europe series, probably the single, along with Bruno Schulz's works, the other really, really important work that was published was This Way for the Gas, Ladies and Gentlemen, by Tadeusz Borowski, a Polish writer. Satantango by László Krasznahorkai certainly conjures a different side of life under the Iron Curtain and in Eastern Europe, and sort of the same feeling, though, of living in a sense of hell. Edmund Wilson's To the Finland Station explores much of the history around this, but I would say the most essential nonfiction work would be Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin by Timothy Snyder, and this is a brutal book that examines in great detail and specific numeric detail and primary sources who lived during that time and just the true horror that each of those individuals encountered. And then finally, Milan Kundera in the Czech Republic, then Czechoslovakia, wrote the great book, The Joke, which examines sort of a later side of just how dangerous things could still be, where a man is imprisoned for a joke he made. And that was Kundera's book, but it was also filmed during the Czech New Wave. So let me know if you've read this one. Let me know if you've read any of Kiš's other books or other titles from the Writers from the Other Europe series. I know this was a long one, but this is a really important book, and I really hope more folks are reading it. Thanks.